let's go ahead and get started. So if you're an unfamiliar, my name is Trevor. I am Dubsado's customer education specialist. With me here today, I've got Dan Carter of Redbridge, as well as Chelsea. Chelsea, I apologize. Could you please pronounce your last name for me?
Yeah, no problem. I'm Chelsea Kakook. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Beautiful. So again, if you're just jumping into the webinar here, we are just really excited to talk about surcharging. And I know that it's somewhat of a complicated topic for our users, and it's a topic that gets brought up a lot. This was a feature that was requested time and time again. And we're really excited just to jump into some of the details, as well as some of the history of surcharging. Hopefully we can answer any questions that you have. Towards the end, after we talk a little bit about surcharging in general, we will have a demo of Dubsado's actual surcharging feature. And I'll stick around to actually answer some questions as well. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and toss it over to you guys, and we'll get into it. Sounds good?
Sounds good. Thank you.
Great, no worries.
All right. I just want to make sure that I am sharing appropriately here. Okay, I see how it wants me to do this. Share presentation, share file. Bear with me as it just loads here. All right, perfect. Can we all see the screen? Looks good. Okay. So I think the one thing that we wanted to start in is just give everybody a good, understanding of where surcharging came from and how long it's actually been around. One of the worlds that Chelsea and I live in is the world of Visa and Mastercard, and this long-standing antitrust litigation against Visa and Mastercard. You can often see some news articles about it. There was just a settlement that was reached, but then was once again interrupted by, the likes of, say, Walmart, Target, Best Buy, etc., rejecting it. But, that actually started in 2005, long before Chelsea and I were working in payments. And I really feel like that litigation will outlive Chelsea and I. But as part of that litigation in January of 2013, the card networks for the first time relented and allowed merchants to begin surcharging. They also began to allow merchants to have a choice of whether they wanted to accept only credit or only debit. They also instituted credit card purchase minimums and discounting preferences, being able to reference network cost, which they used to not forbid merchants from saying that, accepting a credit card cost the business a certain amount. But as part of that, they opened up surcharging, and that is when they opened out with the 4% surcharge. They also, as part of that, allowed merchants to have some steering rules, which our good friends at American Express decided they did not particularly care for, as they felt disparaged by it. So in June of 2018, the Supreme Court of the US upheld Amex's position that if you were a merchant accepting Visa, MasterCard, and American Express, that you could not implement steering provisions because it discriminated against Amex as a card brand. So fast forward to 2021. At that time, 48 states had allowed surcharging, or the prior enforcements that they had prohibiting surcharging were seen as unenforceable. So, there are a few states where there may be a law that exists on the books. However, there is no enforcement of that law, so you can't bring a lawsuit against it. But there are a couple holdouts who are very firmly not allowing surcharging as just a pure prohibition. So that would be Connecticut and Massachusetts do prohibit the surcharging of credit cards. And then the territory of Puerto Rico also does not allow it. And then in October of 2022, after some rumblings that we heard from some merchants in Canada and some merchants in Canada really wanting the surcharging to be allowed in Canada, it was opened up in Canada in October of 2022. And Canada was capped at 2.4%. And then, as the networks tend to like to do, they changed their rules. Card networks like to change their rules every April and October. And in April of 2023, Visa reduced the surcharge maximum from 4% down to 3%. In addition, Visa implemented a lot of behind-the-scenes rules that anyone offering surcharging or who is going to come forward with a surcharging program were going to have to comply with. And many of these were new and rather onerous rules, essentially trying to create hurdles so that way, your average merchant would have too big of a challenge to actually implement surcharging and comply with all of the regulations that Visa and Mastercard put out. Chelsea and I work a lot with some of the largest merchants in the nation who interact with the card brands directly. And we know from conversations that we've been a part of that the networks do not like surcharging. They don't like merchants doing it. They actively have, you can usually check their websites or find comments from executives saying that they don't want merchants doing it. So they have, and they've always had the ability to create hurdles to essentially make it difficult to surcharge. And this is where, a partner like Dubsado has been really active in looking into how can they take a lot of those onerous requirements that you would have to follow individually yourself. How can they take that off of your plate and incorporate it into their product? So that way, only the things that you absolutely have to do are something that's going to be on you. They've really taken a lot of steps to internalize and take those actions on their side. So moving from a historical view, I think one of the things that we run into a lot, and frankly, we see quite a lot, is the improper usage of particular fee classifications. I know to many people, these words don't have as much of an impact, but in terms of the card network operating guidelines, these words have very specific meanings to them. And that means that they only anticipate that merchants use them in those limited applications of such. I think we often see fees like a service fee, and it's a credit card fee, or you see a convenience fee that's probably positioned incorrectly. And chances are those are non-compliant applications of those fees. There are very specific rules that govern each of these and how they can be applied. So, from what Dubsado is offering is what is generally referred to in our industry as a direct surcharge. So this is where it is very clear that the fee that you are charging is for the usage of a card. Under direct surcharging rules, you are not permitted to surcharge any debit card. Debit cards always have a kind of special place within the card networks because just of the way the money flows, right? A debit card is essentially akin to writing a check more so than it is to a credit card, where when you're spending on a credit card, you're technically spending the bank's money and you have to pay the bank back. Whereas a debit card, it is the customer's money. So they do create different rule sets for those different card types. Of course, they have the 3% cap for credit and 2.4 cap for Canada. There's, higher compliance requirements under this. And there's other ways that you can then kind of use a carrot and stick approach potentially, which is you can offer cash discounting So you can, if you want to get paid in a different way, say like a bank transfer, etc., you can always either like implement a discount there or offer that at, no added fee to kind of, give customers a different option. There's also generally what's referred to as an indirect surcharge. This is invisible to all of us. We're probably all encountering indirect surcharges every single day, but these are essentially where you factor in your cost of acceptance into the cost of your product. So it's always very interesting, for Chelsea and I, when we see big interchange rule changes go into play, whether the follow-on several weeks later as we see retailers slightly increase their prices, because you can increase your price. There's no one stopping you from increasing your price. That's totally within your control. And whether you choose to say, hey, there's no fee for us, but your price is slightly higher because you're going to recoup your costs that way, you can certainly do that. And I do believe the Dubsado team is great with helping on pricing recommendations. But you can also, apply that to anything, any payment method you want and incorporate that way. Now, the next one is one that I see abused more so than almost anyone, which is a convenience fee. And convenience fees have very specific rules attached to them. One being that it must actually be a bona fide convenience by providing an alternative payment channel, right? One of the areas where we see convenience fees most often abused is merchants who are e-commerce or card not present only, trying to assess a convenience fee, right? Obviously, if a card not present or e-commerce method of collection is your only payment channel, you under the card networks are not providing a convenience. That's one area where we typically see a lot of misapplication or incorrect usage of that term. And merchants using that term can potentially be submitted to the card networks. They can process a complaint and they will reach out to that merchant typically within 30 days of a complaint being filed. I think it's clear that I know these rules very, very well. And maybe I've done this a few times, most recently to my own building for charging a convenience fee on rent payments, because another aspect of convenience fees is that you cannot charge a convenience fee on any recurring payment. Again, the networks see a recurring payment as not a bona fide convenience, right? It's your first one, yes, maybe, but all of the other ones seems like you're kind of in the business of accepting recurring payments. So they do not allow that. It also has to be a flat fee, and you have to apply it to all payment methods that are offered through that payment channel. So you could not, and I've seen people do this, potentially maybe you have seen this as well, where there's a convenience fee for credit cards, but there's not a convenience fee for pay by bank, right? You can't do that. You have to, if it is a bona fide convenience, then that fee applies to all of those payments offered through that channel. So we often see that convenience fees are misapplied. FYI, I won the dispute with my building. I got the convenience fee removed for everybody paying by bank. So no one sent me a letter, but that's okay. And then the final one that we really see misused quite often is the term service fee. So service fees in coordination with credit card fees or positioning as a means of recouping credit card fees is only allowable for merchants operating under what is a education or governmental merchant category code. You'll see that shortened down to MCC. There's a little bit more flexibility here because, again, this is supposed to only be for a small class of merchants, right? So if you were paying tuition, you might see a card service fee. That's allowable under the rules. If you were potentially making a tax payment or paying for a permit from a local governmental office, that would be allowable because those two classes of merchants are allowed to do so. You can, of course, certainly dispute whether you feel like that service fee is too large for the payment that you're processing, because the networks do say that that must be a reasonable reflection of the cost of acceptance. So a service fee cannot technically be anything the merchant wants. And again, the card networks always have a very open ear to anyone filing complaints. I think the number is like 911 Visa. I think 1-800-911-VISA. Sad that I know it, but maybe it's because I've called it before. And they have a very easy complaint process online as well. So, I think merchants are often misusing that and just really taking the gamble that no one reports them. Also, and this really applies to a lot of these other different fee configurations, is that you really cannot be charging a service fee in coordination with a convenience or a surcharge. Really, this applies to all of these classes. You can't charge a convenience fee and then charge a surcharge on top of that. The card networks are pretty clear that it is one or the other. Pick your lane and stay in it. And also there is a requirement for disclosure. So I think one of the challenges that Chelsea and I really see in the market and what we see when we're helping others evaluate, is player A who offers this solution really the best player for us? Or when we hear stories of, okay, but so-and-so down the street is doing this, how come I cannot do this? And you have to check the fine print of some of those providers. They usually create a very large distance or like legal distance between them and what they're actually supplying, which is, hey, we don't know if what we're doing is legal or not. It's your responsibility to know whether what we're doing is legal or not. And if you get in trouble, we take zero responsibility of you getting in trouble. So one, they're already distancing themselves from their own product, knowing that they probably don't know all of the rules. And also, it is one of those things where operating until you get caught is maybe not the best model to operate under. We have seen that the card networks have been increasing their enforcement of merchants misusing surcharging. They actively pursue and can send, Amex being one of the most notorious, sending secret shoppers to establishments to determine whether they are following rules. And really it's those other providers are really asking people to gamble on whether someone will complain and file a complaint. And, we think the best option is to provide, a solution that operates within the rule set and keeps everybody safe who's participating in. I think we would all, as generally consumers, want everyone to be playing a fair game and not anybody trying to cut corners where, they may want to cut corners. But making sure that it's a fair game is important, and making sure that the rules being followed are important, because I'm sure none of us, we don't like encountering that in our everyday world, right? When we're going out and shopping, or we're going out and interacting with small businesses, right? Like, we don't want to be taken advantage of, or, paying an unnecessary fee that maybe isn't even allowed to be charged to us. So I will raise my hand and say, because I know these rules way too well, I'm not the one to try it on. And I have reported multiple merchants, and I've won every single challenge I've ever brought to the card networks, because they send you a little notification letting you know that you were successful. So I know that I'm successful in challenging these assertions where I've seen non-compliant merchants operating. And that's why we're giving you this information. We understand that there's a lot that gets done out in the market. Chelsea and I encounter merchants who come to us who are non-compliant already, and we have to sit them down and tell them, like, hey, your convenience fee actually isn't appropriate. Like, you know that, right? You have to change that. You are running a big risk, because once you get caught, you are going to be told to stop. And if you do not stop, you're going to start to get fined probably every single month you continue to do it. So understandably, there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of misinformation out there. I mean, we still even see some of these providers promoting a 4% surcharge, when obviously that has not been allowed since April. And it just kind of like makes you scratch your head about, how good is this solution provider if they can't even update their website to stay in line with what the rules actually are. So with that, I will turn it over to Chelsea here to go over the next slide.
Thank you, Dan. So let's get into a little bit more specifics around the state regulations and where the jurisdictions lie. So as you can see here, where Dan mentioned, that surcharging is allowed in the majority of the US states. If we go back, a few years prior to these most recent Visa, Mastercard settlements, you really weren't allowed to offer surcharging, but that has been overturned. And as the states kind of gain more and more traction, those listed on this map on the left, you'll see some yellow states. And those were the states that had rules and regulations about surcharging. Here were the specifics. And those states have all had their laws challenged, which, whether it be through a court case or the attorney general coming back and overturning that regulation. So they've had banning, but they've basically diminished over time after they were challenged, and now they're, quote, unenforceable. So that's been kind of a great movement we've seen over the past couple years. You can see here also those red states, and those are the, I guess you could say, a few of the states that don't allow it. And then there's 2 states that have a fairly complex requirements. But Dan mentioned earlier, the states that do not allow surcharging whatsoever are Connecticut and Massachusetts, also Puerto Rico. So we have those where there's a no-go. And then when we talk about Maine and New York, those are the other 2 states you can see in the red. We'll get more into that on the next slide, but they have fairly complex requirements that have to be split out and detailing a cash price and a non-cash price. And that can be really difficult to implement in a card not present environment. So as far as Canada, they do not have any restrictions. So that one you can see there is all green. So we're good for those Canadian sales that you guys have, or Canadian merchants. Dan, do you have anything to add to that?
No, because I think we call them the special states because they're a little bit special. One is
so Colorado these are the ones where it gets a little bit tricky, right? So Colorado has a restriction which sets their surcharging to 2%. However, if your cost of acceptance is higher than that 2%, you can provide a specific disclosure that details that cost. Now, keep in mind, the overarching rule of governance, right, are Visa and Mastercard, where it's set at the 3%. So, we can add that. That's where you have the 2% rule from Colorado, but the max of 3% from Visa and Mastercard. And so you do have that statute, and that disclosure is added in for those Colorado merchants and in the Dubsado platform. And then in Maine, their requirements are pretty much the same. And I think there is some challenging going on right now in the courts in those states, but it has not had any outcomes where it's going to allow for loosening of those laws as of today. And so what they require is that the merchant must have a breakdown of, here's your cash price, right? And then here is your price with the surcharge included. And as I mentioned, that can be difficult to disclose and ensure you're meeting those requirements in a card not present environment. So as of today, New York and Maine are excluded from the surcharge program.
Yeah, I'll just add that I believe it was February of 2024, New York just increased their requirements as well. And a lot of the legal guidance that we had seen and a lot of other solutions providers post that update to the New York law have all advised that merchants simply stop surcharging or attempting to surcharge in those states, because the enforcement from New York can be quite swift. And I believe like the first infraction for New York is already $500. And so it can be very challenging to operate within their guidelines. As Chelsea mentioned, some of those legislators have been contacted by the industry to go over how they wrote that law, because, the legislators wrote that law without asking anybody whether what they were writing was going to work, because there are a few portions in that updated law that actually really do not work with even what Visa and Mastercard say are allowable. So there's a lot of tension in those markets right now. And as such, the best advice is to probably steer clear from using a direct surcharging method in those particular states. Obviously, an indirect method is still allowed. You can increase your price as much as you would like. But definitely, I know that Chelsea and I have had plenty of conversations around this. Okay, but how do we, from an e-commerce perspective, like how would we build out cash price, or how would we do this? And unfortunately, it's just not that clear, and the risks are really high.
Correct.
Do you want to touch on interstate commerce, Chels?
Yeah, so in terms of the interstate considerations, as it mentions here, there have not been any legal cases or cases challenging the regulations. And so our recommendation is to just go with the state where the merchant is located, right? You're going to be, you don't necessarily know if someone are they living in Minnesota, but they're having it shipped to Michigan, right? So going with the state that you're located in, which is one of the items too that's really important when you're setting up your registration, is the team understands where your business is headquartered. So that one there's not to be anything too different with that portion of it either.
Yeah, and I think our perspective is we are not lawyers ourselves, so not legal advice from us, but we've even seen two major industry providers, both acquirers, take two different positions here. So one takes the position of it depends on where the cardholder's zip is registered. And the other leans on the side of it is where the business services are performed that actually dictates what state you follow. And again, this is probably an instance where no one really thought about how interstate commerce was going to be impacted by this. And there hasn't been anything major that would really give us too much of an indication of how the court systems would particularly interpret this, unless you're like a big SCOTUS news follower. Maybe you might have an idea. But, again, this is one of those situations where like we think it's best to err on the side of where the business services are performed or consumed. So if you're, doing business in a state that allows it, you're probably going to be okay. But also, I think Dubsado has a notice here, right, to let them know if you were changing states, if you move, to let them know as soon as possible, so that way they can do their best to keep you safe as well.
And I think another, as you guys can see here, just from these changes with the yellow states that have had laws challenged, a lot of this is still fairly new, right? And so there's things that have to be learned and changed from the regulations as this continues to become more of a normal business practice.
Yeah, some of the challenges as well in those states aren't even related to whether a credit card surcharge should be allowed or not. Like, I think one of them is like a free speech case where like saying that you have a surcharge on a sign, like, can a state prevent you from doing that because that prevents your speech? So it's interesting how things move along on these, but so far we've generally seen those yellow states surcharging being used, and not seeing anything legally popping up around those. So I think of all things, there's probably one thing that can be the most challenging for merchants to adhere to, because it is typically the one thing that does fall most squarely in your corner as a business owner to follow. And that is really the disclosure requirements. So Dubsado has, taken painstaking steps to ensure that point of transaction disclosures have been incorporated. So that way your customers, it is referred to as being trapped in a checkout. Your customers do not feel as though they are trapped in a checkout. Those disclosures have all been included. Where, some of the onus is going to fall on you, and it falls on all merchants who are, utilizing a surcharge is that point of entry notification. So depending on how you're particularly running your business, whether you let's say you have a pricing sheet listed online, and on your pricing sheet, it says that you take Visa, Mastercard, Discover, and bank payments. So typically on an e-commerce or card not present environment, you are going to have to post a notice about your intent to surcharge at the first notice of where you accept payment methods. So you are required to do that. And the same follows through for kind of these mail order or telephone order, not really a mail order who's really doing that anymore. But obviously if someone, calls you and asks you what payment methods can I pay you with, or if there's a catalog of prices, you do have to mention that there. At any point that you accept face-to-face transactions, you do have to post signage at your entrance of that. So that way people know coming into your store that, they're going to be assessed a fee. Where Chelsea and I are aware of enforcement taken against merchants there's typically two main areas of enforcement that we see. Well, I guess three to be specific. The top three areas where we see enforcement are signage, debit card surcharging, and what was that? I just forgot it. Signage, debit card usage. Oh, receipt. How could I forget receipt? And receipt requirements. So again, Dubsado has taken care of the receipt requirement for you. But, and also the debit card issue for you as well. But that signage one, it's just such an easy one to get busted on that you really want to make sure that you take the steps to protect yourselves, because it just takes a customer taking a screenshot or taking a picture, and they can just go to one of the websites and say, hey, I was surcharged here and there was no sign. And Visa and Mastercard tend to take the consumer side most of the time. And it's really easy to submit evidence through those portals. So we wanted to just call this one out here because we know it's a little bit on your guys' shoulders, but it is an area where we see merchants getting complaints that stick to them very easily because they just missed a signage requirement.
Yeah, so just to reiterate, when you're, looking at your website, just consider where you have mention of the payment options, and then that's where you need to have that disclosure at. So most of the time your payment options are on the, checkout page. You may have a menu page, but if you do have them listed, sometimes you'll see sites where they have it listed just down at the bottom of various pages, and you kind of forget about that because it's not specific to a payments portion, but it does need to be mentioned there.
All right. And not to scare anybody, but here's the fine structure.
Yeah, so this is where you can see the card brands do not take they do not take it lightly if merchants are just out there implementing their own 5% fee or here and there, or not choosing to utilize the compliance and the regulations. So you'll receive a warning for the first infraction. That will come and you'll Visa or Mastercard, they will have received a complaint, or I don't know if there's a magic official number, and then they'll issue out that initial warning. And from there, you move into this first tier, which you can see is $5,000 for the first tier, and then it's $5,000 after each occurrence, up until you hit $25,000, and then you move to the next tier. And then that same methodology is utilized here, where it's 25,000, and then continues on at the 25,000. I think by tier 3, I'm sure everyone on this call is thinking, "Holy smokes, that's pretty large." But then you move up to the 100,000. Now, between these tiers, at some point, the card brands, Visa, they can put, requirements. They can terminate before those if they would really want to. But they, of course, probably, benefit from these hefty fines. So I don't think it's anything to be taken lightly. But the great thing is Dubsado has put a lot of this in place for you, so you can be in compliance and have a compliant surcharge program in place. I don't know, Dan, was there anything else we wanted to talk about in terms of the specific fines?
And I mean, we are providing these fines as we know them. They may differ from different acquirers, simply because Visa may, the networks may strike different fining due to an acquirer's actions, etc. Like if they deem an acquirer more problematic, they may have higher first fines for merchants operating under that acquirer. So, this is generally what we have heard, but typically, especially in the small business, space, right? The operating under the guise of, I can be non-compliant because I'm just going to get a warning. So I'm going to take my risk until I get a warning. Well, what happens if you get multiple people report you at the same time? So you have multiple instances, maybe one right back to back to back. So they process multiple cases. Your warning might be followed by a fine anyway, because multiple people reported you. So, it's one of those things where, the risk may just simply not be worth it because of those, hefty fines. And again, we know these fines from this is what we know the acquirer gets charged. There is nothing to say that an acquiring partner or somebody couldn't, change these and assess higher fines. So it's generally what we know. The best of what we know and what we've learned and have been able to, obtain from our partners within the industry itself. But other than that, that is really the end of our kind of lecture, I guess we could say. I think if I know we can turn it back over to Trevor here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dan. Thank you very much as well, Chelsea. I appreciate you guys. That's a ton of information, and hopefully that was really helpful for our users. And really what it kind of boils down to is the surcharging feature that we have created, which is why I'm excited to share a quick demo of our actual feature in case some folks haven't seen it just yet, since it did just launch this week here. So Chelsea, Dan, you guys get to stick around for a couple minutes. The demo will only take about 2 minutes, and then we'll get to some questions. Does that sound good?
Sounds great. Yep.
Great.
Thank you very much, guys. Cool. All right, I'm going to go ahead and throw this demo up here. All right. So in this hypothetical right here, let's say I'm a photographer and I just sent my client this invoice, right? As the client, I can access my Dubsado invoice and click on this Pay Now button down here at the bottom to go ahead and make a payment. So when I click on Pay Now, our new Dubsado payments modal is going to show up here. It's cleaned up. It's much easier to tell the difference between card and US bank payments. But right here at the very top, you can see the first difference, right? It's a $100 session deposit, but we're listing at the very top there, it's a $3 credit surcharge. That's due to that 3% surcharge that's enabled in this account. So we're listing it right there at the top. I go ahead and enter in a card number. We'll go ahead and make a payment. And don't worry, this is just a test scenario, not a real credit card. So don't worry, I'm not sharing my own credit card details here. We'll go ahead and punch in all of our details. And now, different from our last Stripe integration, we have this review payment button. And below that, we also list out even more specifically, right? A 3% surcharge is applied on credit card payments. And if you pay with a debit card, that surcharging fee is actually removed on the following page. So when we click review payment, we get another little pop-up right here that just shows the final payable amount for $103. And then we do need to have that surcharge split up and listed separately. So we're showing that there as well. So go ahead and click pay, and the payment was sent. And as Dan mentioned, we are taking care of that transaction requirement for you, or that receipt requirement for you, because as soon as we make that payment, the receipt is automatically sent to the client. It's also specifically listed out on that receipt there. Now, here's the alternative scenario, right? Let's say I was that client and coming back to my invoice to go ahead and pay for my actual session fee. I click pay now once again. And this time I'm going to go ahead and pay with a debit card, actually. So we're going to punch in a different card and we'll see what happens here. Again, just another fake credit card, so don't worry. This one's a little bit more complicated.
Don't go writing that down.
Exactly. When I was first looking at that fake credit card, I was like, this looks oddly real. So it's not real. Don't worry. Again, we're going to go ahead and click review payments. And on this following screen, we can see that that surcharge was actually removed, right? The system is able to determine that it is not indeed a credit card and that surcharge is no longer applicable. So the client's going to go ahead and just pay the sticker price for that session deposit there, or that session fee rather. And then just the same, right? Regardless of whether a client is actually paying a surcharge or not, with Dubsado payments, you are now going to be sending transaction receipts automatically. So you can see here on this particular receipt, right? It's just a $100 payment. No surcharge was added. And that's about it. It's a relatively straightforward in the Dubsado end of things. Once you actually have it enabled, it works pretty flawlessly. And hopefully that was instructive for anybody that hadn't seen it just yet. But I think we're at the point now where we can go ahead and open it up to the chat and see if we have any questions that we want to answer for you guys. I know we have some stuff in the Q&A, so I can jump over there first. Let's take a look at what we got in there. So Amy asked, is it legal to have the invoice line item say CC fee and have the description as direct credit card surcharge? Dan or Chelsea, feel free to jump in here and tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that that's part of something that we would consider to be non-compliant. Is that correct?
Yes. And essentially we have, I believe Dubsado has already built in messaging features already. So all of that is taken care of for you. I think where you would run the risk of adding that line within the Dubsado environment is you might accidentally then double surcharge the person, which would then put you over the amount that you're allowed. And you may run into complications with that. Dubsado has put in a lot of effort to test a lot of scenarios here and take a lot of, I know Chelsea and I had plenty of like customer feedback sessions of making sure that these types of scenarios were considered. So all of the compliance around messaging at the point of transaction should be taken care of.
Yeah, exactly right. Thank you, Dan. Cool. Let's jump over to a question from Ellie. So she asked earlier, other than the signage disclosure on a website, does there need to be a notice on your contract, essentially, right? This is going to vary from user to user as far as in Dubsado end of things, at least. And from my understanding, right, if you are only mentioning your payment methods that you're accepting on your contract, that's the first time you're talking about it, then you would want to have your disclosure there. But there's plenty of other places where you might first mention your accepted payment methods. At that point, you'd want to have your disclosure as wherever that point may be, whether it's your website or maybe a Dubsado proposal would be a really common place to list that out, since that acts as an order form for a lot of users. If you have it elsewhere, you wouldn't need to also have it on your contract, but obviously it's entirely up to you if you did want to include it there as well. All right, let's see what else we got here.
I think there's one that's maybe a little bit more of an integration question. I see a question around a question of Square, the Square charge for every single transaction, even if it's a debit card. I think that really depends on how an integration with Square is set up, right? The acquirer doesn't really take a ton of responsibility here. They put the onus typically on merchants. So like your larger merchant, maybe like a regional store, et cetera, they would have to build all of that out. Maybe someone like a Square would offer that. But if the software that you're using doesn't have like how Dubsado has the ability to check and verify that is either a credit or debit card. If that check is not being ran, you could accidentally surcharge a debit card and then have someone file a complaint.
Yeah, to double back to that integration question from Amy, just real quickly. So if it sounds like you're using the QuickBooks invoice itself and not connected through Dubsado, you obviously can use our integration with QuickBooks, but it sounds like you want to use the actual QuickBooks invoice itself. You kind of have to go one or the other, Amy, unfortunately. There's not going to be a way to directly integrate the actual QuickBooks invoice with the Dubsado piece. I think doing it the way you've been doing it now is as close as you're going to be able to get to that, as opposed to the Dubsado invoice with the QuickBooks integration and going in that direction. All right. Robin asks, we use Stripe for processing our payments. They charge 3% on debit card payments. So how do we handle that? So what we were talking about earlier, right? We're not able to surcharge on debit cards. If it's a situation where you're seeing most of your clients, for example, are only paying via debit card for whatever reason, that might be a situation where you might implement an indirect surcharge, since we cannot surcharge on those debit cards rather. But there's not going to be a way to utilize the surcharging feature to handle that 3%, unfortunately.
Yeah, here's an important call out. Anybody who is allowing that is non-compliant.
Compliance, yeah.
Yeah, and it's a very serious risk.
And even though the debit card may be I mean, technically, when those are processed, if they are, at a cheaper, it's just the rules that come down from Visa and Mastercard. They will not allow surcharging on debit cards. So that's a great thing, Trevor, that you mentioned. That's kind of the case where it would be best to try to build that into your cost if you have a really high ratio of debit card clients.
As opposed to, you could also consider, potentially having a pay by bank option, right? Debit card is just an easier way to pay by bank. So you could open up a pay by bank option and offer that as a lesser cost payment method. But as the team mentioned here, potentially looking at pricing that in.
Exactly.
A question here about using the term non-cash adjustment as a line item on an invoice. Is that compliant in states that allow surcharging? I think where you're really running into a danger there is trying to use language to circumvent rules. Non-cash adjustment would be considered the additional fee for the purpose of paying by card. And that would be interpreted by Visa and Mastercard as you utilizing a surcharge and trying to move around their compliance and guidance rules, which would probably not land you in a good situation should someone file a complaint. The biggest challenge is when you position something as a fee only because someone is paying a specific way, right? If it's not a bona fide convenience, if they're paying a certain way, the networks associate you as trying to recoup that cost, just trying to hide it from the customer. And that is something that they most certainly do not like.
Definitely. All right, I threw some more questions from the general chat here to the Q&A for us. So in Dubsado, can you only accept credit cards and not debits? It's a good question. It's a question we've been getting relatively frequently lately. Unfortunately, when you are connected with Dubsado payments and you have the credit card toggle turned on, that's including both credit and debit cards. So there's not currently a way to differentiate between credits and debits on a brand level, if that makes sense. And then to follow up with that, similarly, Kay asked if the pay by bank option is available on Dubsado invoices. And yes, it definitely is. So with our Dubsado payments integration, you can enable ACH payments. That's the same thing as a bank transfer or bank payments. And that's what Kay was mentioning just a minute ago about a lower cost option as far as processing fees are concerned, since it's going to be capped at $5, which is fantastic. And then Joy asked, let's see. Does the surcharge need to be applied to all invoices, i.e. web development services versus monthly hosting? Really good question, Joy.
Yeah, so one of the things that the networks do not like is they do not like selective applications of surcharging within what is considered a channel of business. So if you have, let's say you had your web services business as a completely separate business from your monthly hosting business. So you kind of operated under two different, like we would call them merchant locations. You could, in theory, do that. It is more challenging and it takes more work to get those two pieces to talk together. But generally, most people are operating under one processing location. And in those cases, you are not allowed to selectively surcharge specific customers or for specific services. It is seen as discrimination across your customer class. It's something that Chelsea and I get from a lot of our larger B2B merchants who only want to surcharge a subset of their customers. And we actually have to go through and create a lot of specific infrastructure behind the scenes to even attempt to support that. What we see generally in the SMB world is that is just too big of a challenge to overcome. And therefore, you would not want to selectively surcharge specific customers just out of worries of potentially seen as discriminating certain customers.
To tack onto that just a little bit, so in the Dubsado end of things, when you turn surcharging on, it's going to be on at a brand level for all invoices. So there isn't the ability to turn it on or off for clients, right? For example, if you have your web development service clients or monthly hosting. So in line with what Dan is saying, to try to keep you safe from even accidentally discriminating against a particular client, it is on an brand level when you enable surcharging. Cool. Here's a good question from Marlene. Can one mention that they get a 3% discount if paid by ACH when that surcharge already applied and built into the pricing, so indirect surcharging? I'm not really sure how you would interpret that, Dan. I'm curious.
Can one mention if they get a 3% discount if paid by ACH when surcharge is already? Okay. Yeah, you certainly can. You can apply cash discounting in that case, right? We see that a lot. Customers who are pricing a fee in are often usually subtly trying to suggest to their customers, please pay me this way because I want you to pay you this way. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a carrot here to come pay me this way. So you can certainly utilize cash discounting or discounting for a lower cost payment method in that scenario. Yeah.
And if you're building in that pricing too into the indirect, remember they're not seeing that. So it's totally doable.
That's a good point, Chelsea. Yeah, because you're the one setting your prices, so your clients aren't going to know that you chose to try to account for that average cost of acceptance there. Cool.
Oh, I see a convenience fee question. My favorite types of questions.
Yeah, go for it.
So you would have to apply that convenience fee to any payment method provided within that channel. So, that's really where it comes down to the challenge, right? Now, paying by check, is something that is typically only a physical payment method, unless it was like mailed in and you have and this is going to if you were using a lockbox facility, which I don't think you are. So if you only accepted payments by mail and you were offering people the ability to pay you via credit card by mail, and that's where you were trying to go and get those that convenience fee, then yes, you would have to apply it to a check as well. It's any payment channel that you are offering. So let's talk Ticketmaster because they're the worst, right? Part of why Ticketmaster is continually able to provide a convenience fee is they say, hey, you can still pay at the box office. You can pay in person. So this online channel is our convenience, and we will convenience fee you all day and all night because you can just go pay in person. And so that's how they navigate around that, is they just push people to pay in person.
And to tack on to that once again, so with Dubsado, our surcharging feature is a direct surcharge. And part of agreeing to be compliant with our surcharging feature is that you're not going to additionally add on a convenience fee or a similar kind of fee, right? So if you are choosing to enable surcharging in your Dubsado account, then you are also basically agreeing to not add that additional convenience fee on there as well, just to stay compliant. All right.
I see this question from Ninia. If you accept credit cards on Dubsado and have a surcharge, must you also apply a surcharge on other platforms to be in compliance with the credit card companies? I'll take a guess here, but I would assume you'd want to apply that surcharge, right? So you have the same thing across the board. But if you were not able to apply it on a different platform, then it could pose where you just can't utilize that. But I don't know, Trevor, if that's something within the Dubsado piece. If she's mentioning platforms within Dubsado.
If she's applying to other platforms, sorry, I was trying to read the question in chat there. Give me 1 second to catch up here.
Oh, no, that's okay. I wasn't sure if there were platforms she was mentioning within Dubsado or if this is in regard to actually completely other
I see.
Providers.
So the way I'm parsing that question is, we don't have more than one platform to pay on in Dubsado. If she's using Dubsado, that'd be the one platform.
Yeah.
I think she's mentioning that if she chooses to enable surcharging in Dubsado, then elsewhere where she might be accepting payments, right? Let's say that you have a Dubsado account, so maybe you also have a Shopify separately, right? which I think she's asking, like, for example, in that scenario, would she have to apply that surcharge to the Shopify payments as well, or not, essentially, or any other kind of external?
Yeah, you don't have to, but I would think if you're in, the business of wanting to earn back your cost, you can do that, but you still have to follow. So if they don't offer anything where you don't have the ability to go in and set that up, then your kind of hands are tied. So
sure, yeah, that makes sense. That was my feeling on that question as well.
Yep.
Cool. All right, we are coming up on time here, guys. It's been a little bit more than an hour, so we'll take about, I think, 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll call it a day here. So let's see here. Elliot asked a previous question about essentially that disclosure statement on her contract, right? And we talked about how it's going to depend on a user basis. So Ellie had a follow-up question to that, which is, let's say you have that disclosure on your website, right? And your client is a referral, so they don't actually end up going to your website at all. Would you as a merchant need to understand the flow that particular client went through and then have that disclosure elsewhere in the process because it's unique to that one client? They didn't see your website where you have your initial disclosure there.
Sure. So like, let's say it's and like we've ran into this with like travel companies that have customers who come in through a different channel. So they're going like basically straight to a checkout. Sure. At that point, your point of transaction is the only disclosure that you would need to provide because they haven't seen anything else. They haven't interacted with anything else. So you would be covered by the disclosure that Dubsado Payments has in the point of transaction.
Cool. Thank you, Dan. Sweet. All right. Cassandra asks, is indirect surcharging illegal in any U.S. states? My gut says it's going to be a no, but any notes on that one, guys?
I mean, like, unless a state had a particularly aggressive price fixing law, which would probably still have a lot of leeway and probably be only going after like very large businesses. You are correct. It is legal in all states. You are allowed to amend your pricing however you feel fit.
Totally. All right. Last question here, guys, from the chat. Is there a way to request specific credit cards on the invoice to avoid clients using a debit card? Unfortunately, right now, there's not going to be a way to use the payment modal that pops up to guide users into one way or the other. And that's part of the regulations around this, is that we can't lock people into using one kind of payment method or another. If you notice back on that demo, right, when you get to that second make a payment screen, there is the ability for them to go back and change their payment method because we need to let the user, or the client rather, choose what kind of payment method they want to pay with. And that is, again, part of keeping you all compliant.
Yeah, that also kind of gets into like Amex anti-steering provisions, right? So if you're accepting Amex would be the first person to say, like, you cannot say pay me with a Visa card or pay me with a Mastercard. It falls under this the rule called honor all. And so it is one of the areas where they were successful in, and again, they won a Supreme Court case over this, of preventing merchants from asking customers to pay them with a specific payment method if you accept American Express.
Totally. All righty, folks. Thank you all, everyone, so much for attending this webinar here. I know there was a ton of information, but I do hope it was helpful and informative to everybody. Keep in mind that we're going to be sending out the recording of this entire webinar to everyone who was in attendance. And I want to give a big hearty big hearty thank you to Chelsea and Dan of Redbridge, our partners in building the surcharging feature. Thank you both, Chelsea and Dan, for being here, for taking the time out of your day to answer these questions, and for all the help you've given us. It's been an absolute pleasure. We'll catch everybody on the next webinar. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.